February 14th, 1990. Snow had fallen in a thin, indecisive veil over Paris, and the city above walked through its own mist like a dreamer crossing rooms in the dark. Beneath it, the tunnels kept their old weather, a constant chill, a damp that did not glisten so much as cling, a smell of chalk, old breath, and the dull sweetness of minerals rubbed to dust by time. The catacombs had learned to be patient long before Paris learned to be fashionable. Skulls nested in walls beside femurs, stacked into order like firewood. For a winter no one planned to survive. It was a city under the city. Straight lines and sudden collapses. Numbered passages that only remembered being named. Somewhere in that stone memory, a lens blinked awake. The video began with a white cough of static. Then, a light, thin and panicked, tunneling a path for itself. There was no voice, only breathing. A human held the camera too close to the movement of his own fear. At first the path was generous, a corridor with a spine of calcite overhead, and the ground packed hard by careful feet. The beam skidded over graffiti. Years, hearts, an anchor, a crude face. Then settled on a neat square of sign, its letters rotted at the edges by damp. Arrête. Beyond the sign, the ceiling lowered like a landlord reminding tenants to be quiet. He walked farther. The camera insisted on recording what the man's eyes preferred to skip. The open grin of a skull where the stack had slumped. A patch of wall where moisture had collected in a pockmarked constellation. A doorway bricked up with a haste that made it look embarrassed. Sometimes his light jumped sideways, as if the tunnel itself had balked. Twice the tape caught him turning to look behind him, framing his own shadow, which jittered along limestone like a puppet forged from exhaustion. The breathing changed. No longer the even draw of someone exploring his own boldness, but the tight sips of a person keeping pace with a thought he does not like. This is what the tape showed later to those who transferred it from its plastic coffin to a television in a white room, that he went deeper without noting he was doing it, that the map in his head had been paper left in a pocket through a wash, that the air itself had acquired a grain, like sand you can't see but can feel in your teeth. He stopped once and panned his light over a room whose walls had been arranged into neat patterns. Skulls like a frieze, femurs like pilasters, an architect's consolation to the unhouseable dead. The beam lingered on a set of numbers carved into the lintel, 1787. Someone had been proud of an arrangement that made sense of an overflowing cemetery. Someone had measured and stacked and tightened the knots of wire that held the stories together. This comfort lasted 3 seconds. Then he moved on, because comfort is thin down there, and quickly used up. He caught a sound not his own. The tape thickened with it. A grain in the picture where it shouldn't be, something like a whisper, lower than human speech, syllables paired to their bones and carried by drafts. He pivoted. The camera saw floor, ceiling, wall, his hand in awkward close-up. The light went briefly blind when it met water suspended in the air and mistook it for stars. He shone back the way he had come, and the path narrowed, as if distance had changed minds. He tilted the light down and saw footprints. His own. A series of dark ovals, repeating. No other marks. He tried to set his boot in one of the prints and discovered that his shoe fit too well. He had come this way. He had not noticed he had come this way. His breathing sharpened to blades. He walked more quickly, the camera joggling. Once, the light slid across an inscription carved with excessive care. Arrête. Du es ici. Stop! You are here. He brought the lens so close that the letters filled the frame like a mouth forming them. The whisper came again, closer now, and finer, like the residue of speech rather than speech itself. The tape put a snow of grain over this moment, the way machines sometimes do when they feel the need to be truthful about their limits. He turned the camera to himself accidentally. A sudden slice of a cheek, a beard scatter, an eye so wide the iris seemed thin. Then he pressed on. There were rooms where the bones did not line up. Mud had slumped. Supports had tilted. The camera's light found a black curve in the ceiling and followed it down, until it became a crack running through skulls like a parting. The breathing hitched. There is a kind of fear that never raises its voice. It simply sits on your chest with a small, enduring weight. When he panned left, the tape caught a detail the living seldom bother to look at. A single vertebra, out of place in a tidy wall of long bones and symmetrical skulls, resting on the floor as if it had decided to leave the choir. He looked behind him again. He kept looking behind him. Each time, the tunnel had shrunk by the thickness of a breath. Each time, the shadow seemed to be learning his name. He did not say his name aloud. The whispers did not need him to practice it for them. His light skimmed a puddle the color of coins. The beam made of it a mirror, long enough to show the fragile halo the lamp wore, and then erased the reflection, apologizing. When he pointed the camera at his feet, the sound of water began to accompany his steps. A small, sharp music, like cutlery gently knocking in a drawer. The floor tilted. The tape caught the light coming up to meet it, and then corrected course. The lens choked on dust. He came to a place where the tunnel resolved into two options, both narrowed by the impatience of stone. Left held a blacker black. Right offered a square piece of plank nailed over an opening, with the piety of someone who has seen something and gone home to find a hammer. The plank had writing, scrawled in the blunt honesty of charcoal. Pass a press, not past here. He pointed the light down. The ground bore a reminder. 3 sets of footprints, long since dried, turning back. He stood, the sound of his breathing filling the little room with its routine, and small flecks of dust traveled through the beam like minute planets that had forgotten their orbits. He chose left, because warnings are lighthouses that some men do not believe are for them. The camera tried to accommodate. It brightened then dimmed, learning the tunnel's appetite for light. In this part of the warren, the patterns were less careful. Bones jutted from the walls without the mathematical consolation of stacks. Skulls stared from improvised niches, their eye sockets so still they read as a protest. The whisper came again, nearer. The tape's microphone flattened it into a sibilant smear, as if it were coming not from ahead, but from inside the circuits. Then the breathing doubled. First there was his, fast now, shallow, the throat holding it the way a fist holds small coins. Then a second, layered under the first, slower, and not in time with the heart the camera could hear say its steady, unpopular truth. He stopped so suddenly the light swung up and wrote a white arc on the ceiling. The second breathing did not stop. He turned, carefully. The camera held out before him like a gift he didn't want to give. The lens found only corridor and whiteness, and a thin seam of water threading under the far wall where 2 stones met like lips. He raised the beam, and one skull looked for an instant to have moved because light made it confess a second expression. He lowered the beam, and the skull re-elected its first face. He began to run when something small and implacable in the air changed direction. The tape showed the light bouncing off planes, wall, floor, wall, like a trapped thought. His boots struck the ground in a 2-beat pattern. The camera exaggerated this into a learned stutter. He went deeper by running, because panic is a compass that forgets north. Heavy drops fell from a seam above and struck, making the unceremonious sound of someone spitting. He slid once, caught himself on a pile of bones, and cut the back of his hand. The camera, dispassionate and curious, gave the world a close-up of that blood briefly, a colour foreign to the rest of the tape. He did not notice he had bled. He noticed only that the whisper had found his name. You could not hear it clearly in the white room where the custodians watched the recovered footage. You could not hear letters as letters, but you could hear a contour that language knows when it is being used to point. The whisper said what whispers always say when they are doing their jobs properly. Here. It said it in a way that encouraged haste. The last minute of the tape moved like a confession. He ran. He turned. The beam struck an inscription that offered no poetry. Just a number. 134. He held on that number for a moment, as if it could be asked to behave like a prayer. He moved again. The ceiling came down another finger width. The camera saw a pair of shoes set neatly against a wall, the laces tied, and did not stop for them. He said something. It could have been a word. It could have been a sound he invented to excuse the noise of his fear. Then the world turned to nails. The footage ended abruptly. No scream, no final placing of the camera on the floor to observe, no confession of where he thought he had gone wrong. A white glare, a smear of grey, then tape hiss. Empty. The breath of a machine that had not been instructed to die at the same moment its owner's attention did something unpredictable. When the city workers found the camera months later, wet, patient, loyal to its own function, it lay at the lip of a chamber beyond the marked paths, a space resculpted by collapse and whim. They did not go in. They reported, and the report became a paragraph appended to a thick file that had always preferred maps to anecdotes. No one identified the man. Inquiries were made of missing persons. Names were floated and sank. The 2 minutes of face the camera had accidentally recorded were too incomplete to be useful and too human to be easily forgotten. Someone said he had been a student because the tape's first few moments caught a cuff's edge with ink stains. Someone said he had been a tour guide for his friends, who then did not wish to remain in photographs. Someone said he belonged to the catacombs the way certain stories do, and that such belonging is the opposite of finding. Urban explorers, cataphiles, with their keys to covers and their mimeographed maps, watched the footage and did what obsession always does in the company of death. They learned more routes. They traced the path the light had carved. They recognized the corner where the sign lay like a gutted bird. They admired the contempt implied by the detour. And at night, in the total dark, when they dared to obey the bravado of wisdom and turn off their flashlights to feel the place on its own terms, some of them heard it. Their names, said softly by a voice standing very close. It wasn't always perfect. Sometimes the voice forgot a syllable. Sometimes it whispered the name they nearly had, the one their parents had considered before choosing the one that was entered on forms. Once, a woman who hated her nickname heard the tunnel use it anyway, and the affection in the sound startled her so much she laughed. The laugh was brief. It collapsed in the dark like a held breath let go for the wrong reason. There were other reports. The footprints that arranged themselves in mud that had not yet been walked. the sudden curve of a wall that seemed to have learned a new geometry while you blinked. A pair of glasses found folded on a rock shelf, as if removed with care by someone who had finally agreed that seeing was an obstacle. In one gallery, a man swore he photographed a figure at the far turn, standing very still, head tilted, shoulders listening. The picture, when developed, showed only a bright flare where the figure should have been. The way light behaves when it decides to preserve a stranger's modesty. Above, Paris carried on with its duty of being admired. Lovers followed the old map of corners and bridges. Children threw bread to birds that had long since learned the trick of gratitude. Buses exhaled. Cafes counted their chairs. The Seine bothered the same bulls of current and would not be consoled. Below, the catacombs repeated their sentences. The voice that knows your name learned to be patient with multilingualism. It learned that some people would refuse to answer even when spoken to correctly. It learned that calling is sometimes enough. There are signs now, bright, and designed by people who think fonts can warn. They say no. They say fines. They say danger with such confidence the word softens. But a mouth that has spent 2 centuries learning to speak through stone will not be silenced by print. The tunnels breathe. They make the sound of water deciding, of distant traffic translated into a rumour of drums, of the small things that live where light has been dismissed, learning to step without being seen. And if you go where the path narrows, and if the cold noses your wrist with the intimacy of a dog, and if you switch off the light because some part of you wants to be counted by the dark, you will feel breath near your ear that is not your own. It will say your name, not like a threat, like a ledger balancing. You will turn the light back on so quickly, your hand will forget a step. You will see only wall and bone, and your own permission to continue. You will either continue, or you will not. The tunnels do not care. They are polite in the way of things that have endured every kind of refusal. But later, above ground, crossing a street where the headlights make little lakes of white, you will find yourself turning to see who has followed. No one has. The voice has remained below, doing its night shift, practicing the names of those who have not yet asked to be remembered. There is a man still running on a tape that ended 3 decades ago. He runs in the breath of a machine, and in the small part of your mind that understands that roots are not a guarantee, but a suggestion. He runs through walls arranged by people who intended order and found something more persuasive. He runs with the sound of whispers pressing his shoulders forward until everything narrows into a decision. Stop. You are here. The letters live, damp at the corners, the warning both accurate and insufficient. The catacombs know the rest. They always do. They keep their counsel and their temperature. They keep stacking because time does that all by itself without asking hands to help. They keep a voice in reserve, soft and certain. For those who will turn off the light not out of courage, not out of contempt, but because some part of them wants to hear their name without the city interfering. When that happens, the tunnels make good on their reputation. They lean in, and the dark says what the living find hardest to tell each other without help. Here, May 20th, 1896. The Palais Garnier glowed like a jewel box in the night. Every window lit, every carriage wheel outside, whispering wealth across wet stone. Paris was dressed for the evening. The banners outside promised Faust, and the foyer's mirrors doubled the crowd's brilliance until the air itself seemed gilded. Beneath all that brightness, the orchestra tuned. and a stagehand named Etienne Carrière stood behind the heavy curtain, listening to the murmurs through the velvet. He had worked here 10 years, long enough to know that applause could sound like a warning if you listened properly. He was on the rigging crew that week, tending the iron lattice of pulleys and counterweights that held up the chandelier, the great glittering mass of bronze and crystal that hung over the audience like a frozen sun. It weighed more than 4 tons. Etienne had touched its chains that afternoon, felt them tremble with a faint, continuous hum, as if metal remembered something the living had forgotten. He had told the chief mechanic, "It doesn't sound right." The man had laughed. "Nothing in this house sounds right. It's an opera." At 9:14 p.m., during the second act, that sound became a scream. No one heard it over the orchestra at first. The music swelled, violins bending toward the edge of pain. Then the ceiling gave a single, terrible groan. Etienne felt it before he saw it. The vibration in the soles of his feet, the air sucking backward, the instant of silence that came before a world breaks. The chandelier tore loose. The fall was not a crash. It was an eruption of light. Crystals burst across the audience in a glittering rain. The metal frame struck the stalls and split open like a rib cage. The music stopped. Screams began. Smoke rose from the burst gas lamps, smelling of oil and iron and burned silk. A woman lay beneath the wreckage, her hand visible, the glove already dark with blood. That night, the opera house became its own ghost story. By dawn, the chandeliers in every corridor had been dimmed to half their usual brightness. The newspapers called it an accident of faulty wiring. The stagehands called it the curse. And when the corps de ballet returned 2 days later to rehearse, they found roses scattered across the stage. Black, stiff petals, tied with a ribbon as red as an open wound. No one admitted to placing them there. The Palais Garnier was built like a secret. One world above, another below. The public saw marble staircases, gilded ceilings, angels sculpted mid-flight. But underneath, past the rehearsal rooms and storage tunnels, the foundations sank into catacombs and water, an underground lake fed by the same veins that ran through Paris. The engineers had built around it, leaving a dark reservoir beneath the stage. Some said the architect, Charles Garnier himself, used to descend with a lantern and watch the water ripple, listening to the echo of the world he had created. Now the lake was still, perfectly still, as if waiting. Etienne stayed on after the accident, repairing what could be repaired. He slept little. The theatre had changed its sound. Every corridor carried a faint echo like footsteps, arriving a second too late. One night, closing the trapdoor beneath the stage, he heard a piano playing above. Slow, deliberate. The same refrain from Faust that had filled the air before the chandelier fell. When he climbed up, the hall was empty, the keys untouched, the air still trembling with the last note. That was when the first whisper began. The phantom is real. The dancers spoke of a figure in black seen in the upper balconies, never walking, never speaking, only sitting in the shadows, half lit by the lamps. One swore she saw a mask glinting, another that she heard breathing from the seat beside her while she tied her shoes in the dark. Each time someone tried to approach, the figure dissolved into emptiness. The night watchman began to leave extra lamps burning. It didn't help. One swore he saw a man crossing the stage at 3 in the morning, cloak trailing, moving without sound. When he called out, the man turned, half his face white, featureless, like marble smoothed by years of touch. The watchman left his post and never returned. By winter, the legend had a routine. A rose on the stage every Monday, the faint sound of piano on empty nights, and the occasional whisper of fabric when no one moved. The managers mocked it in daylight, but they refused to rehearse after midnight. In February, a new soprano arrived, Camille Deforge, a woman whose voice could still the air like snowfall. She had read the reports, laughed at them, and demanded the role of Marguerite. During her first rehearsal, the electric lights dimmed midway through an aria. A single gas lamp flared near the back of the hall. Camille stopped singing. There, in the highest balcony, sat a man in black, perfectly still, as though carved from the architecture itself. She felt his gaze on her skin, cold, assessing, almost reverent. "Who's there?" she called. Her voice echoed too long. The conductor turned, saw nothing, and shrugged. But when the lights brightened again, a rose lay at her feet. That night, she went to the director's office and demanded to see the restricted corridors. Etienne, overhearing, offered to guide her. Half out of curiosity, half out of the strange loyalty that grows among those who share a haunting. They carried lanterns, their light trembling over the gilt and dust. Past the stage machinery, they reached the lower levels, where the air smelled of damp stone and something older than water. The staircase twisted downward until they reached the edge of the underground lake. The black surface reflected their lantern as a perfect star. Camille crouched beside it, mesmerized. Etienne watched her face double in the reflection, one bright, one drowned. "There," she whispered. A ripple spread across the water. From the darkness beyond the lantern's reach came a single note. Piano, soft, deliberate, echoing across the cavern. It hung in the air like a question. Then another note answered it, and another. The melody building. The same refrain from Faust again, the same that had played before the chandelier fell. Etienne stepped forward, holding the lantern higher. "Who's there?" His voice broke into shards against the walls. The music stopped. A breath passed through the tunnel, close enough to move the flame sideways. The water stilled, flat as glass. Camille's reflection smiled. She did not. They left quickly, neither speaking until they reached the stage again. The next morning, she found a letter on her dressing table, written in black ink, unsigned. "Sing only for me, that others do not hear you properly." Weeks passed. Camille's performances grew stranger, more perfect, more sorrowful, as if each note cost her something invisible. The audience adored her. The managers celebrated their profit. But the stagehands avoided her dressing room. They said they heard two voices inside, hers and Armand's, whispering in counterpoint. On March 3rd, during dress rehearsal, a mirror shattered in her room without being touched. A shard lodged in the wood opposite the vanity, slicing through the edge of the letter she had kept hidden. She sent for Etienne. When he entered, the gas lamps flickered as if bowing to something unseen. "I think he's under there," she said. "Under the stage. The music comes from below." Etienne believed her. That night, armed with a second lantern and a length of rope, they returned to the underground. The stairwell was colder. Their breaths smoked in the light. The air hummed faintly. The vibration of unseen machinery or something pretending to be machinery. They reached the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the lantern flame like an eye. Across the surface drifted a single object, a white half mask, floating face up. Camille reached for it. The lantern dimmed. A hand rose from the water, pale, slick, human, and touched her wrist. She screamed. Etienne lunged forward, pulling her back. The hand sank, leaving no ripple. The mask slipped under. They ran. Behind them, the piano began to play again. Harder, faster, the melody collapsing into chaos, as if the keys themselves were being torn apart. When they reached the staircase, a voice followed. Low, melodic, neither echo nor hallucination. You shouldn't have looked. After that night, Camille refused to sing. She left the opera and vanished from the city within a month. Etienne remained, though he avoided the lower levels. The management replaced the chandelier with a smaller one, afraid of weight. They banned talk of phantoms, but the legend didn't die. It adapted. The stagehand still found roses, always black. The watchman still heard piano scales drifting from the dark between walls. Once, during a matinee, a stage curtain fell too soon, cutting off a soprano, mid-note. And for a heartbeat afterward, another voice carried the phrase to completion. From nowhere, from behind the proscenium, deep and precise. Visitors to the Palais Garnier today walk its marble halls and whisper about the lake. They peer through grates into the dark, hoping for reflection. The staff smile politely, but none will stay alone after midnight. They say, if you linger in the auditorium long enough, you will feel eyes on you from the upper tiers. Look up too quickly, and you'll catch the suggestion of movement. A shape adjusting its seat, a gloved hand at railing. Look again, and there's nothing but velvet and shadow. And sometimes, when the house is empty and the chandeliers are dim for cleaning, a single piano note drifts through the silence, sustained and perfect, followed by another and another, until the melody of Faust climbs the air once more. The workers stop what they're doing. They listen. They know better than to go backstage. If you stand near the orchestra pit, you can almost hear the breathing between notes, the sound of someone waiting for applause that will never come. Below, in the black lake, the water never moves. Not even when the building trembles with music. It waits, smooth as a mirror, listening to the weight of all that sound pressing down from above. And if you lean close, too close, you might see your own reflection tilt, smile, and whisper your name. October 6th, 1927. Fog climbed Rue Lepic like a shy thief, pooling in the doorways and thinning to threads where the steps deepened. Montmartre smelled of coffee and cheap wine, of coal smoke and rain on limestone, of paint drying behind shuttered studio windows. The Sacré-Cœur, perched like a pale thought on the hill's crown, watched with impassive eyes. Below, the cafes lit their mirrors and let the night try its tricks. A seamstress named Elise crossed the square with a parcel under her arm and a pin still in her sleeve, forgotten in the hurry of leaving. She had worked late mending costumes for a revue no one admitted attending, and now the streets were making their long, slow pivot to midnight. Her shoes knew these stones. So did her shadow. When the woman appeared, Elise almost greeted her as a neighbor. Elegant dress, hair neatly tied, steps like a metronome set deliberately slow. She lifted nothing but attention. Even the fog accommodated her, thinning around her figure as if unwilling to smudge the lines. "Do you think I am beautiful?" the woman asked. The veil over her face was black and fine, more suggestion than concealment, pinned just under the ear with a mother-of-pearl comb. The voice carried no accent. It had the friendliness of someone trained to sell you something, and the sorrow of knowing you cannot afford it. Elise, who had learned the economy of compliments in a city that measured them like sugar, smiled and dipped her head. Yes, she said, without calculation. Very. The woman's gloved hand rose halfway, reconsidered, fell. Thank you, she said, and the words fogged the air slightly and then disappeared. She didn't lift the veil. She did not move. She simply stood, the plea folded back into her like a letter never mailed. Elise thought to offer the rose she kept in her pocket for luck, a tired little bloom that had seen 2 kitchens and 3 arguments and still smelled like someone's attempt at romance. But the woman had already turned, steps resuming their measured descent, and was gone in 3 heartbeats, absorbed into the fog as if the hill had edited itself. In the morning, over coffee at a cafe whose mirrors had seen every version of love, Elise told the story. The waiter shrugged with that practiced Parisian charity for other people's nights. An old painter at the window turned his head and said, "She comes and goes. Ask the tobacconist." The tobacconist, when asked, rolled a cigarette as if rolling a memory. "Sometimes she speaks," he said. "Sometimes she only stands, and you feel sorry you have a face." By noon the city had stolen the story and sewn it into its hem. That evening, 2 young men argued in front of the Lapin Agile about whether etiquette required lifting your hat to a lady who asked such a question. A group of tourists from the provinces laughed and made up a song. The mirrors set into the cafe walls rehearsed their usual trick, doubling the room and storing its mistakes. In one of those mirrors, just after the second round of pastis, a woman's veiled profile appeared over an empty chair. She turned slightly, as if listening for her cue. No one sat there. When the waiter came with the tray, the smell of roses wandered through the room and fell apart like a promise. An apprentice sculptor named René met her next. He was carrying a plaster cast wrapped in linen that suggested a human head more than it declared one, and his fingers were powdered white in a way that made him look like a baker ashamed of bread. At the corner where Rue Gabrielle narrows to a certainty, she stepped into his path with the courtesy of someone interrupting a fight. "Do you think I am beautiful?" she asked. "Yes," he said, because the answer arrived before judgment. He had been taught by Stone that beauty is an argument you can only lose by talking too long. He felt a sudden desire to unstrap the cast and offer its face to her, and he hated that desire with the intensity of honest prayer. The woman's hand went to the veil. René held his breath the way men do when they expect a blow and prefer to experience it fully. She lifted the veil. Underneath there was nothing to interpret. No bones, no indentations, no eyes closed in modesty. The skin was uninterrupted, smooth and pale as a page before ink, a face-shaped absence, a body's refusal to complete itself. The street's noises, 2 men arguing about Zola, a dog complaining about no one in particular, a tram sighing, fell away in a small respectful circle around the moment. René's hands tightened on the parcel until the plaster whispered under linen. He did not scream. It would have been rude somehow. He lowered his eyes and nodded as if agreeing to a revised contract. She dropped the veil. The smell of roses arrived late, like someone entering a theatre after the lights have gone down. He stood a long minute watching the fog remain itself. Later in his room, he unwrapped the cast and saw that during the walk, the plaster face had pressed against him and given up part of itself. The cheek was smudged. The mouth slightly softened. He went to the mirror and, for a second, could not tell whether his reflection had kept its appointments with his features. He touched his cheek and thought he felt his own skin consider anonymity. Montmartre knows how to compose stories. What goes in as rumor returns as routine. A dancer said the woman followed her along the stairs of the funicular, steps matching steps with the patience of rain. When she said no, no, I'm late. No, I won't play. The figure did not speak but simply maintained the distance all the way to her door. She fumbled the key twice before the third turn caught. On the other side, the neighbor heard her sob and opened the window, heard her change her mind, heard her sit in the chair and breathe until morning. At dawn, she swore she smelled a wilted rose on the sill, though no one walked the narrow roof that night. And the cat refused to explain. A bartender at Chez Plumeau swore the woman once came in and sat at the end of the zinc. I asked what she would have, he said, and she said nothing, which is an order I can fill without error. He put her glass down anyway, and then looked up because the mirror had captured another guest. White gloves folded, veil still. The room's smoke arranging itself to an old composition around her. When he turned, the stool was empty. When he looked in the glass, the seat was occupied again by the reflection of no one at all. He wiped the counter and felt the disloyalty of perspiration at the back of his neck. I prefer men who are not poems, he said to the mirror, and began to stack clean glasses as if all this were the work of hygiene. There were rules, or people invented them, and then confused the invention with rescue. If you said yes, she might leave you your night. If you said no, even kindly, no, not now, no, I am cold, no, my wife is waiting, she might follow, never closing the distance, never hurrying, never explaining. People reported stepping into their courtyards and feeling watched from the leap of shadow where the lamplight failed. They reported keys misbehaving, doors that took an extra turn, the sound of a heel on stone that elegantly matched itself to theirs, and then stopped just outside the bedroom. A poet claimed he wrote her name in steam on a mirror and could not make it dry. The landlady bleached the glass. The fog returned it. A boy too young to be allowed such nights drew her from memory on butcher paper. A veiled oval. A dress more precise than gender. Hands that understood their own grammar. His mother burned the drawing in the stove, and for a week the kitchen smelled faintly of roses, even when the pot was soup. In November, a tourist from Vienna came to see the view, and found himself in a cafe instead, because panoramic rumors are vulnerable to weather. He drank 2 cognacs and rediscovered his accent. The mirror opposite him tied the room together with the modesty of old glass. In it, the tables duplicated themselves like promises. At the far corner of that reflection, a woman sat alone. He turned to see her and found a chair, a hat forgotten, a coat folded with that formal neatness Parisians reserve for things they permit to touch their skin. He turned back to the mirror, and the woman was looking at him. Or rather, that place where a face had refused occupation was pointed directly at the angle of his gaze, which felt like being observed by a very patient fog. "Do you think I am beautiful?" she asked. Not breaking the rules by speaking inside his head, but not using the air either. He said nothing. He was proud of having cultivated the ability to say nothing. He paid. He put on gloves. He left no coin on the table because barbarian politeness had deserted him. On the street, the sound of her steps matched his as naturally as 2 hearts falling into time. He turned right instead of left. She turned. He walked into a shop that sold ribbons too expensive to be called necessary. She did not enter, but the bell did, ringing for no one. He exited with a piece of satin he would never use and felt gratitude so elaborate it resembled superstition. She followed him to his hotel. He did not sleep, which made the next day easier to write about and harder to live. A policeman laughed once when the story grew tiresome in the station. 2 days later, he woke from a dream of walking uphill forever and found a rose on his windowsill. Not fresh, wilted, the bend at the neck seductive and exhausted, the smell like memory admitting defeat. He locked the window. He placed the rose under a drinking glass, as if oxygen were the problem. In the morning, the glass was empty. He did not mention it to his colleagues, because ridicule is a thin blanket when nights grow teeth. There were theories. A bride burned by a scorned lover's acid, preserved by shame and magic. A mask maker's daughter who tried on the wrong work and could not remove it. The ghost of a courtesan who lost her clientele and then her details. An allegory invented by men who wanted to be frightened by the consequences of their appetite. A warning whispered by women to girls in the doorways. When you are asked to define beauty, run, even if the question arrives neatly dressed. None of these made the woman less present. She occupied the hill the way scent occupies a room, insisting politely, arriving before itself. On certain nights, the mirrors in the cafes gave up their tantrums and behaved like calm water. Faces floated there with double candles on either side. A pianist played in a corner because old songs know what to do with new fear. When he paused, the footfalls outside arranged themselves into a rhythm he could not help but count. He played to drown them. They kept time anyway. Ellie saw her again in December, just after the first snow made the steps into theatre and the air into confetti. The woman stood under a lamp that turned the falling white into applause. "Do you think I am beautiful?" she asked. And this time Elise felt the question less as inquiry than as ritual. The answer she had given before sat on her tongue like bread. She swallowed it. "Yes," she said, and then, betrayal of curiosity. "May I help you?" The veil lifted, not high, not offering spectacle, enough to show the clean refusal of a face, enough to remind a person that the world does not owe them features. The veil fell again, as if modesty were a muscle. The woman took one step forward and reached out with a hand that belonged to a dancer. Fingers acquainted with discipline, palm uncalloused but strong. She placed the gloved fingertips on Elise's wrist, where pulse writes its own poem. A light pressure, a borrowed count. Then she let go. The scent of a rose that had enjoyed itself too thoroughly and was now teaching itself to leave. Then nothing. Elise went home, opened her parcel, and found inside not the sequined bodice she had repaired but a mirror. Plain. Framed in wood that had learned weather and laughter. She tilted it toward the lamp. Her face obeyed. She raised her hand. The woman's fingertips had left 5 pale crescents in her skin. Not bruises, not marks, just the memory of contact. They faded as she watched, claimed by her body. She didn't sleep. She sat in the chair and listened to the hill rearrange its breathing. Years do the work, years always do. Wars pass through cities like weather that overstays. Children become their parents' biographies. The Sacré-Cœur keeps its careful watch. The funicular breaks and is fixed. Painters move on, taking their hunger to cheaper light. Montmartre keeps its trick of offering views that make people think better of their own stories. The cafes keep their mirrors. At night, they sometimes ripple. A veil appears in the glass over an empty seat. A glove turns slightly on a tabletop that has not been set. A question enters the room and sits beside a drinker who believes himself immune to being asked anything. Do you think I am beautiful? If he says yes, the air loosens its grip on his throat, and he breathes as if outliving an old fear. If he says no, the walk home acquires another pair of footsteps, measured and elegant, never hurrying, refusing both anger and pity. And always, the next morning, somewhere on the hill, the soft private scent of a wilted rose lingering in a stairwell or on a windowsill or in a pocket that the owner does not remember opening. The flower itself is never there, only the air that remembers it, holding its shape for a few more minutes, then deciding to become weather again. Elise grew older and mended smaller things. René made a statue that museum guardians accused of spiritual indecency because the face he sculpted was a smooth oval, and people do not like to be reminded of their dependence on features. The dancer married. Twice. The policeman stopped laughing and began to walk home by busier streets. The pianist left Paris and found that the rhythm of footsteps on lonely hillsides in other countries sounded more or less the same. On certain anniversaries, accidents must have anniversaries, even if the accident is a person. Someone in Montmartre notices the fog is unusually faithful. It wraps the corners like cotton around porcelain and makes the lamps into small suns that refuse scholarship. At the top of the steps, under the basilica that never learned to blink, a woman stands, dressed for an evening the city forgot to continue. She asks her old question. The world offers its practice answers. The veil lifts. Sometimes it does not. She may follow, she may not. The mirrors catch what they can and keep it the way glass keeps fingerprints, absent until the light explains them. When she vanishes, the only thing left is the scent of a wilted rose. It rises softly, confessing a former glory without a regret, then withdraws into the hill's breath, into the wineglass air, into the pockets of people who, without knowing why, find themselves looking differently at their own faces when passing a window. They do not look for long. That is the rule, and, like all rules Montmartre respects, it was invented by the hill itself for the sake of the living.